Early on April 9th, 125 bombers and fighters thundered against Trincomalee. The enemy obviously expected our attack, for the harbour was empty of major shipping, and a large number of fighter planes met our aerial formations head-on. Our post-attack tabulations indicated that the Zeros shot down 56 enemy fighters, including 10 Hawker Hurricanes. Post-war investigation revealed that the British lost 9 out of 11 Hurricane fighters that day. Our bombers sank one merchant vessel, damaged several other ships, and set aflame harbour installations. For the first time since the opening day of the war, enemy bombers attacked the Nagumo Force's aircraft carriers. Even as our formations bombed Trincomalee, 9 British Blenheims made a daring assault against our warships. None of the twin-engined bombers succeeded in their attack. Zeros destroyed the entire enemy force. We were to be still further elated by the events of the day. Admiral Nagumo could not believe that Trincomalee had not harboured major British warships. These same vessels, he reasoned, upon receipt of yesterday's patrol bomber report, had fled Trincomalee for the greater safety of the open sea. Simultaneously with the raid against the enemy harbour, our reconnaissance planes fanned out in a wide search for the ships which the Admiral was convinced were in the area. His efforts did not go unrewarded, for the flagship deck soon received the electrifying news that a reconnaissance plane had sighted the British aircraft carrier Hermes, accompanied by a single destroyer, later identified as the Vampire, close to Trincomalee. Again, Nagumo launched his 80 Type 99 dive bombers under the command of Lieutenant Commander Egusa. Led to the long-sought British carrier, the dive bombers plummeted from the sky in devastatingly accurate attacks. Hit after hit racked the 2 enemy warships, and more often than not, flames and smoke, rather than the slender plumes of near misses, billowed upward. Our planes were literally unopposed and swarmed furiously over the warships. Egusa's men once again achieved an incredible percentage of direct bomb hits. So unusual was this accuracy, unparalleled even in future operations, that to calculate the number of hits we had to count the misses and subtract these from the total number of bombs released. Within 10 minutes of the first bomb drop, the Hermes was a gutted, flaming hull, its deck ripped to splinters, its sides shattered by bomb explosions. 5 minutes later, only 15 minutes after the first dive bomber dropped from the sky, the Hermes slipped beneath the waves. The Vampire was already gone, literally torn into great pieces of wreckage. With their remaining bombs, Egusa's men sighted and sank an enemy merchant ship and 2 smaller vessels. Our planes were establishing new records and changing the accepted concept of sea-air warfare. At Pearl Harbor, a limited number of fighters and bombers from this same fleet broke the back of American battleship power. Off Malaya, for the first time in history, our planes sank enemy battleships without the aid of surface vessels. And today, for the first time, aircraft without the support of surface vessels had sent a carrier to the bottom. Lieutenant Commander Egusa was my Okumiya classmate, both at Etajima, the Japanese Annapolis, and in the Navy Flying School at Kasumigara. We both were Navy senior dive bomber pilots. Shortly after the Indian Ocean operation, in which Egusa figured so prominently, we were able to have a reunion in Japan. At the time, as an air staff officer of the 2nd Carrier Task Force, I was preparing for the Midway and the Aleutian operations. I asked my old friend how his planes had sunk the British warships. Egusa looked at me and shrugged. It was much simpler than bombing the Setsu, that's all. The Setsu, simpler than bombing Japan's old target battleship. With the Indian Ocean operation concluded with these brilliant victories, the activity of the famed Nagumo force, which had swept aside all enemy opposition from Pearl Harbor to Ceylon, came to its end. Our gains were consolidated, and now there were new tasks for the powerful naval and air units. We who knew intimately the actions of these battles realized only too well that the greatest single factor contributing to our victory was the superior performance of the Zero fighter airplane. Except in the battle in which our torpedo and level bombers destroyed the Prince of Wales and the Repulse, our bombers were able to cause such havoc only because the Zero had won control of the air. Perhaps only a few of us were cognizant of the fact, but the Zero had become the symbol not only of our land and sea-based air power, but of the entire Japanese military force. Prior to the outbreak of hostilities between Japan and the United States, the majority of the Navy's high-ranking officers foresaw defeat for our surface vessels in a showdown struggle against America's powerful array of warships. Because our naval carrier and land-based air forces so aggressively attacked and pursued the enemy, however, we gained a tremendous, if unexpected, margin of victory. As early as the first week of April of 1942, an incredible 4 short months after the explosive outbreak of war, the Navy completed its prearranged first-phase operations. We roamed the greater part of the Pacific and the Indian Oceans, securely entrenched in our conquests, and our naval air and surface forces kept the enemy at a respectable distance. To the disappointment of many naval officers, and to the relief of others, our carrier force had failed to engage the American aircraft carriers in combat since the opening of hostilities. Once they saw the outstanding superiority of the Zero fighter sweep aside all enemy opposition, the majority of our officers looked forward to the first carrier-versus-carrier engagement. By April of 1942, we had caught and destroyed only the U.S. seaplane tender Langley south of Cilacap, Java, and the British aircraft carrier Hermes off Trincomalee of Ceylon Island. Following the successful Indian Ocean operation, we planned an offensive campaign against the Solomon Islands and the southeastern part of New Guinea. Our major goal in this offensive was the capture of Port Moresby on the latter island, which was the only air base from which enemy planes continued to strike back at our still advancing forces. By capturing this vital enemy airfield, we would eliminate the air threat to Rabaul and Kavieng. Parallel to this operation, other surface forces would support an army invasion against Tulagi in the southern Solomons. We needed Tulagi as a base of operations from which we could subsequently strike out at New Caledonia and Fiji. Intelligence reported that it was very likely that an American surface force, centering about at least one aircraft carrier, was at that time in the Coral Sea area, and that this fleet could seriously threaten the projected Solomons and New Guinea actions. Admiral Yamamoto directed the 5th Carrier Division of the Nagumo Force, then returning to Japan after the Indian Ocean operation, to participate in the new campaign. Under command of Rear Admiral Chuichi Hara, the 5th Carrier Division embraced the 2 powerful, large-type aircraft carriers, Shokaku and Zuikaku. The impending attack received the code name MO Operation. Vice Admiral Shigeyoshi Inoue, then Commander-in-Chief of the 4th Fleet in the Central Pacific, was transferred and assigned to head the MO attack. Inoue had under his command the imposing force of 2 large carriers, 1 small carrier, 1 seaplane tender, 6 heavy cruisers, 4 light cruisers, and other vessels, which totaled 70 ships. Supporting his carrier-based aviation were 120 land-based bombers and fighters. Inoue broke up his forces into 3 groups: the invasion force, the carrier task force, and his land-based air units. By May 3rd, Tulagi was in our hands. With the island secured by our ground forces, the fleet moved out to its attack positions. Vice Admiral Inoue, overall commander of the MO operation, remained at Rabaul aboard his flagship, the light cruiser Kashima. Rear Admiral Aritomo Goto assigned the 4 heavy cruisers Aoba, Kako, Furutaka, and Kinugasa to Shortland anchorage in the Central Solomons. These vessels remained under his direct command. He dispatched to Rabaul the light aircraft carrier Shoho with 16 Zero fighters, 12 Type 97 Kate attack bombers, and other planes. 11 transports anchored within Rabaul harbour to take on the Port Moresby Army invasion force. Small warships cruised nearby as escorts. And at Deboyne, Admiral Goto had the seaplane tender Kamikaze Maru with 4 Type 0 reconnaissance seaplanes and 8 Type 0 observation planes. Vice Admiral Takeo Takagi, the 5th Cruiser Division commander, became commander of the carrier task force. Takagi retained under his direct orders the 5th Cruiser Division's heavy cruisers Miyoko and Haguro, and assigned to Rear Admiral Chuichi Hara the command of the 5th Carrier Divisions Shokaku and Zuikaku. Each of the two carriers had 21 Zero fighters, 21 Type 99 Val dive bombers, and 21 Type 97 Kate attack bombers. 6 destroyers and other auxiliary vessels supported the carrier force. With the Indian Ocean campaign completed by mid-April, Hara steamed at full speed for the Solomon Islands, arriving in the eastern seas on May 5th. Under the direction of Rear Admiral Sadayoshi Yamada, commander of the 25th Air Flotilla, the supporting land-based air force, consisting of 60 Zero fighters, 48 Type 96 twin-engined Nell bombers, 16 Type 97 Mavis flying boats, and 10 small Type seaplanes assembled at their various bases. The majority of the land-based planes flew into Rabaul and its supporting installation at Leh. Approximately half the flying boats and seaplanes operated from Rabaul harbour, the remainder from Tulagi and Shortland. Even as we prepared feverishly for the Shortland thrusts of our combined land-sea air forces, the day following the capture of Tulagi, May 4th, 80 enemy bombers and fighters attacked our fleet units in morning and afternoon waves. There was a strong possibility that the enemy realized our intentions, for his attack was unusually fierce and damaging. We lost the destroyer Kikuzuki and several planes to the enemy bombers. For the first time, however, we confirmed the existence in the vicinity of American aircraft carriers. It appeared as if the time were drawing near for the first clash between American and Japanese carriers. On the same day, the transport convoy for the Port Moresby invasion left Rabaul. 24 hours later, Admiral Goto's warships slipped out of Shortland. The fleet units would rendezvous at sea and assemble their forces for the final assault against Moresby. In concert with this operation, Admiral Takagi's carrier task force skirted the southern end of the Solomon Islands, and at noon of the 5th steamed to the west of the island group. Moving at full speed, the carriers raced to cover the southern flank of Goto's invasion forces. At 08:10 hours on the morning of May 6th, a Mavis flying boat of the Yokohama Air Corps sighted an enemy surface force 600 miles south of Tulagi. The plane's crew reported at least one aircraft carrier supported by 9 other vessels. Several hours later, a single enemy 4-engined B-17 bomber attacked Admiral Goto's invasion fleet. We presumed that the enemy bomber flew from Port Moresby, and we feared that the troop-laden transports might soon be attacked by enemy bombers. To protect his vulnerable transports, Admiral Inoue ordered the troop ships to change course and proceed due north, in the hope that this sudden shift in course would conceal the fleet from the enemy reconnaissance planes he knew would be scouring the ocean. Expecting that he would most likely engage the enemy on the following day, Takagi refueled his ships at sea on the evening of May 6th. Early on the morning of May 7th, we launched an intensive search for the enemy carriers and other surface vessels. Our reconnaissance planes flew from Rabaul, Shortland and Tulagi. Other planes from the Kamikaze Maru at Des Moines, the 3 carriers and the heavy cruisers took to the air to participate in the search. We did not have long to wait. At 0532 hours, a Kate bomber sighted a single enemy carrier and 3 destroyers 200 miles south of the Shokaku. Admiral Takagi ordered Admiral Hara immediately to dispatch every available airplane from his 2 carriers in an assault against the enemy fleet unit. At 0610 hours, Lieutenant Commander Kakuichi Takahashi left the carriers with an air attack group of 18 Zero fighters, 36 Type 99 Val dive bombers, and 24 Type 97 Kate torpedo bombers. 30 minutes later, at 0640, with Takahashi's bombers and fighters racing toward the enemy ships, one of the heavy cruiser Kinugasa's Type 0 reconnaissance seaplanes of Admiral Goto's fleet sighted another enemy group. A single large carrier and 10 other vessels steamed only 200 miles south of the Kinugasa, or 280 miles northwest of Admiral Takagi's position. Unfortunately, the rich prize of a second American carrier could not be attacked. With only a minimum force of planes to protect his own 2 carriers, the admiral was forced to wait for the return of Takahashi's 60 bombers and 18 fighter planes. He could only hope that the first carrier under attack would be destroyed, and that after hasty refueling and rearming, the group could take off again to raid the second enemy carrier. The fates decreed otherwise. At 09:35, Commander Takahashi reached the position of the enemy fleet unit, as it had been reported by Kate. The carrier and its 3 escorting destroyers could not be seen. The formations spread out and searched the ocean surface in vain. Convinced finally that no carrier was in the area, Takahashi ordered his planes to bomb and torpedo a large tanker and a destroyer discovered in the area. The 2 enemy ships quickly went down beneath the hail of bombs and torpedoes. We later identified the tanker, originally mistaken for the aircraft carrier, as the Neosho, and the destroyer escort as the Sims. Even as Takahashi's planes returned to the Shokaku and the Zuikaku, lookouts aboard Admiral Goto's carrier Shoho excitedly reported many approaching American bombers and fighters. An estimated 95 enemy bombers and fighters plunged from the sky in a devastating raid against the hapless Shoho. With most of its Zeros airborne over the transport convoy, and with only a few remaining fighters to intercept the large enemy force, the carrier was virtually helpless. Heavy bombs and torpedoes split the vessel, and the Shoho soon went down. She was the first Japanese carrier to be lost in the war. In view of the great number of enemy carrier-based aircraft which had destroyed the Shoho, Admiral Takagi reasoned that he faced at least 2 large enemy aircraft carriers. As soon as his first attack force had returned from their wasted mission to the south, mechanics refueled the planes and loaded bombs and torpedoes to prepare for an immediate raid against the American force. Takagi faced a number of difficult obstacles, for the enemy fleet was believed to lie at least 350 miles west of his own position, beyond the normal attack radius of his carrier planes. Further, even if he launched his planes at once, the waning afternoon meant that on their return his planes would reach their carriers after dark. The single-seat Zeros, unequipped for night flying, had to be dropped from the attack group. At 14:30 hours, a second attack group of 12 dive bombers and 15 torpedo bombers, led by Lieutenant Commander Takahashi, took off to attack the enemy ships. Takagi planned to send his planes in at twilight, when the shadowy light would hamper the enemy anti-aircraft gunners. The bombers ran into heavy intermittent rain squalls, and even as they fought their way through between the towering cloud formations, the sun slipped below the horizon. It was impossible to locate the enemy vessels under these conditions, and reluctantly the commander gave up the search to return to his own carriers. Surprisingly, the battle was not yet over. Takahashi's men were exhausted, having been in the air on 2 missions since early morning. On the flight back to their home fleet, Takahashi's pilots failed to sight an enemy aircraft carrier passing directly beneath their planes. The enemy, however, had noticed the approach of our bombers, and as Takahashi's force neared the enemy carrier, it was attacked suddenly by Grumman F-4F Wildcat fighter planes. The Val dive bombers, unusually maneuverable for their size, turned sharply to meet the diving Wildcats. The lumbering Kate torpedo bombers were easy targets for the enemy guns, and in the brief but sharply fought battle, the Grummans shot down 8 of the 15 torpedo bombers, and also destroyed 1 Val dive bomber. Our pilots later reported the destruction of several enemy fighters, but this could not be confirmed. Our planes fled from the hornet's nest into which they had flown, but soon fell victim to the delusions and mirages brought on by exhaustion. Several times the pilots, despairing of their position over the sea, sighted a friendly aircraft carrier. Finally, a carrier was sighted, and the remaining 18 bombers switched on their signal and blinker lights as they swung into their approach and landing pattern. As the lead plane, with its flaps down and speed lowered, drifted toward the carrier deck to land, the pilot discovered the great ship ahead was an American carrier. Apparently the Americans also had erred in identification, for even as the bomber dropped near the carrier deck, not a single enemy gun fired. The Japanese pilot frantically opened his throttle and at full speed swung away from the vessel, followed by his astonished men. Our crewmen were disgusted. They had flown for grueling hours over the sea, bucked thunder squalls, and finally had lost all trace of their positions relative to their own carriers. When finally they did sight the coveted American warship, cruising unsuspectingly beneath 18 bombers, they were without bombs or torpedoes, having previously jettisoned them into the sea. On this day occurred what is clearly the greatest confusion of the entire Pacific War. Neither before this evening nor at any time following did such an incredible series of events take place. Not only were our pilots completely bewildered, but the combination of exhaustion and confusion caused the loss of several planes, in addition to the 9 shot down by the carrier-based Grummons. This loss reduced the effective striking strength of our carrier force and subsequently resulted in our sustaining crippling blows from enemy attacks. On the same day, May 7th, another large-scale air battle was fought with unusual pilot confusion. At 8:20 hours, a Kamikaze Maru reconnaissance plane sighted an enemy fleet of 2 battleships, 1 heavy cruiser and 4 destroyers at 150 miles, bearing 200 degrees from tiny Deboyne Island. Admiral Yamada, then at Rabaul, launched 33 Type 96 Nell bombers with an escort of 11 Zero fighters to attack the enemy fleet. 20 of the twin-engined bombers carried torpedoes, the remainder bombs. Approximately 500 miles out of Rabaul, at 12:30 hours our planes sighted and attacked the enemy, now reported as consisting of 2 battleships, 2 cruisers, and 2 destroyers. Our pilots reported sinking 1 California-type battleship, causing serious damage to 1 British Warspite-type battleship, and leaving 1 cruiser flaming in the water. We lost 4 bombers. When I, Okumiya, investigated this battle after the war with members of the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, I learned that the enemy fleet was commanded by Rear Admiral J.G. Crace, RN, and consisted of the Australian heavy cruisers Australia and Hobart, the American heavy cruiser Chicago, and 2 destroyers, but no battleships. Further, I learned that not a single Japanese torpedo or bomb had struck any of the ships. This was actually the first instance in which our Navy pilots reported battle damages inflicted upon enemy vessels beyond those actually achieved. In this case, the discrepancy was so great as to be ridiculous. There were several reasons for this reporting episode. The targets were highly evasive cruisers and destroyers, which often confused the crews of the attacking bombers. Further, the pilots and crews participating in this particular attack lacked combat experience, and their efficiency ranged far below that of the crews which sank the Prince of Wales, the Repulse, and the Langley. The air units which attacked Admiral Crace's fleet were manned by hastily recruited replacements. On February 20th, the original unit lost 15 out of 17 twin-engined Nell bombers, all with veteran crews, in an attack against the enemy carrier Lexington, which at the time was raiding Rabaul. Replacements had come in slowly, the men lacked training, and crew coordination was greatly in need of improvement. This occasion provided an ominous warning. It was the first action which proved that our reserve supply of fully trained pilots was inadequate, and that we would be faced again with this problem in the future. Thus, the sea-air battle of May 7th came to an end. It was a poor day for our fleet. American bombers had destroyed the Shoho in our first aircraft carrier loss of the war, and we had failed to inflict retaliation upon the enemy carriers. To the naval personnel involved, the destruction of the Shoho and the subsequent inability of our planes to attack the American carriers involved great loss of pride. Aboard the Shokaku and the Zuikaku, Admiral Hara's men grimly attended to their bombers and fighters, preparing them for combat on the following day. To save face, they must by any means destroy the American carriers. Before the sun broke over the horizon on the early morning of May 8th, reconnaissance planes thundered off the decks of both the Shokaku and the Zuikaku. The men still smarted from the events of the previous day. This new and uncomfortable feeling could be erased only by victory against the Americans. At 07:15 hours, Lieutenant Commander Takahashi led into the air 18 fighters, 33 dive bombers, and 18 torpedo bombers, which fanned out in a wide search pattern to seek the American fleet. Less than 10 minutes after Takahashi's departure, the carrier bridge received the news that one of its reconnaissance planes dispatched earlier that morning had sighted the enemy fleet at a position about 200 miles due south of the Shokaku. As anticipated, there were at least 2 aircraft carriers supported by 10 other ships. The message was relayed to Takahashi, and the 69 planes veered onto their new course. A Type 97 Kate torpedo bomber first discovered the enemy carriers, and Flight Warrant Officer Kenzo Kano, using to advantage nearby cloud formations, shadowed the American fleet, reporting by radio to the Shokaku the details of the warships. Finally, his fuel rapidly dwindling, Kano turned for his own carrier. He had full confidence in the accuracy of his reporting, as well as his up-to-the-minute details of the exact positions of the enemy fleet. Barely out of sight of the unsuspecting enemy vessels behind him, Kano suddenly noticed the Takahashi Air Group racing toward its target. Kano realized intuitively that, despite the accuracy of his position readings, Takahashi's group could easily fail to sight the carriers on the vast ocean expanse. Without further consideration for his own safety, for to alter course now was to place himself beyond the point of no return, Kano swung his bomber into a sharp turn and eased the airplane alongside that of Takahashi's. Every pilot in that sweeping formation knew precisely what Kano and his 2 crew members were doing. He now lacked sufficient fuel to return to his own carrier, more than 300 miles to the north. The pilots could see Kano's big 3-seat torpedo bomber swinging about and nosing up to Takahashi's plane. But there was little to be said. Shortly afterward, the air group sighted the long-sought American fleet. The planes swung immediately into the attack, as reported subsequently by Takahashi's subordinate. Starting at 09:20 hours, we made determined torpedo and bomb attacks against 1 Saratoga-type and 1 Yorktown-type aircraft carrier. At least 9 torpedoes and more than 10 550-pound bombs struck the former ship, while the latter was hit with 3 torpedoes and 8 to 10 550-pound bombs. We damaged 2 other vessels. Again, our pilots had erred strongly in their evaluation of torpedo and bomb strikes, for post-war investigation revealed that in this battle, the USS Lexington was hit with 2 torpedoes and 2 bombs, and our planes scored several near misses. The other carrier, the USS Yorktown, received 1 bomb hit and 2 near misses. We sustained heavy losses in the attack, for Lieutenant Commander Takahashi, Warrant Officer Kano, and many other officers and crewmen died. We lost more than 26 bombers, or more than half of the entire bombing force. Prior to this attack, while Takahashi's force flew toward the enemy carrier force, lookouts aboard the Shokaku and the Zuikaku sighted an approaching enemy carrier plane force. Soon they made out more than 80 planes. The Zuikaku was fortunate. Her captain placed the big ship beneath a nearby rain squall, preventing the American planes from pressing their attack. The Shokaku received hits by 3 medium bombs. Although her deck was shattered, preventing the launching or landing of any planes, the Shokaku was still able to maneuver with little difficulty. The extensive repairs needed forced the big ship to retire from the scene of action. Thus ended the first naval battle, which was fought entirely by the air elements of the 2 opponents. In this initial carrier-W carrier contest, our carrier forces and those of the enemy were approximately equal in strength. In the 2 days of fighting, our carriers lost 32 planes, either shot down or missing, and 12 additional aircraft made forced landings. Our losses mounted when the Zuikaku's captain ordered several planes jettisoned overboard to clear the decks for emergency landings of the Shokaku's aircraft, when that carrier's own decks became tangled wreckage. Immediately after the battle, there remained on the Zuikaku as operational aircraft only 24 Zero fighters, 9 Type 99 Val dive bombers, and 6 Type 97 Kate attack torpedo bombers. This number represented barely 1/4 of the original total of bombers aboard both carriers prior to the air battles. These losses indicated clearly the high cost of all-out carrier warfare, and for the first time enabled us to predict the outcome of future fleet engagements in which surface vessels, despite their number or power, would play merely auxiliary roles. Over separation distances of 200 to 300 miles between fleets, the cruisers and battleships could contribute to the battle only by employing their anti-aircraft weapons to help defend their carriers against attacking enemy planes. In the 2 full days of the Coral Sea battle, the approximate total of 95 vessels of both contestants, 25 American and 70 Japanese, did not exchange a single shot. The Coral Sea episode also taught us to study closely the use of fighter planes in air-sea engagements. We discovered that, in a long-range conflict between aircraft carriers, qualitative superiority in fighter planes was not enough to stop a determined attack by enemy bombers and fighters. Quantity also was a requisite for successful defence and, even under the best possible conditions, an attack fiercely pressed home by the enemy would result in severe air losses to both sides. 2 weeks after the Coral Sea battle, I, Okumiya, conferred with Lieutenant Commander Shigekazu Shimazaki, who as a Zuikaku Group commander had participated in the entire battle. Shimazaki told me, "Never in all my years in combat have I even imagined a battle like that. When we attacked the enemy carriers, we ran into a virtual wall of anti-aircraft fire. The carriers and their supporting ships blackened the sky with exploding shells and tracers. It seemed impossible that we could survive our bombing and torpedo runs through such incredible defences. Our Zeros and enemy Wildcats spun, dove, and climbed in the midst of our formations. Burning and shattered planes of both sides plunged from the skies. Amidst this fantastic rainfall of anti-aircraft and spinning planes, dove almost to the water's surface and sent my torpedo into the Saratoga-type carrier. I had to fly directly above the waves to escape the enemy shells and tracers. In fact, when I turned away from the carrier, I was so low that I almost struck the bow of the ship, for I was flying below the level of the flight deck. I could see the crewmen on the ship staring at my plane as it rushed by. I don't know that I could ever go through such horrible moments again." This was the frank confession of a veteran air group commander who had engaged in combat with our naval air forces since the beginning of the Sino-Japanese incident in 1937. Shimazaki was a brilliant and courageous group commander. In the Pearl Harbor attack, he commanded the second wave of 170 planes and subsequently played a major part in our carrier operations. Following an evaluation of his pilots' combat reports and those of his reconnaissance planes, Rear Admiral Hara confirmed the sinking of the Saratoga-type carrier, the Lexington, during the night of May 8th. In his official combat report about the second carrier, he stated, "The Yorktown-type aircraft carrier received hits by more than 8 bombs and more than 3 torpedoes, and was left burning. Listing heavily to port, she is believed to have sunk, although we have not as yet confirmed the destruction of the vessel." As related previously, the Admiral's report greatly exaggerated damage to the Yorktown, which suffered only from 1 bomb strike and 2 near misses. Tactically, therefore, we considered the Coral Sea battle as victorious for our forces. Future events proved this evaluation to be faulty for, as strategic moves would clearly reveal, the Coral Sea battle proved a serious Japanese setback. Cognizant of the battle's implications, Vice Admiral Inoue postponed the Port Moresby invasion indefinitely and recalled his troopships. These, however, were localized events. In Japan, Admiral Yamamoto expressed deep regret at the failure of his commanders to exercise the aggressiveness necessary to exploit the damage our planes had inflicted upon the American carriers. Our ships retired from the scene of battle, although they held in their hands the opportunity to ensure the destruction of the enemy carrier forces in the Coral Sea. One of the direct reasons for this failure, of course, was the fact that few planes remained aboard the surviving Zuikaku. At best, this could be regarded only as a poor excuse, for reduction in numbers is hardly a deterrent to the true battle commander. The truth of the matter was that our senior naval commanders in the Coral Sea area lacked the fighting spirit necessary to engage the enemy. This failure to pursue a temporary advantage later proved to be of tremendous advantage to the Americans. A post-battle study of the Coral Sea engagement brought out the fact that neither Vice Admiral Inoue nor Vice Admiral Takagi had on their immediate staffs a single air officer with combat experience in carrier-based or land-based air operations. It was incredible to realize also that both admirals likewise lacked any experience in this type of combat. For years, the Japanese Navy had operated against enemy forces on the principle that, while it might be numerically inferior to its opponents, our Navy could overcome any combat obstacles through superior tactics and aggressive fighting spirit. In a single stroke, the Coral Sea battle destroyed the validity of this concept, making it abundantly clear that the greatest weakness of our carefully created naval air strength lay in the lack of senior commanders who could command our crack units. Leadership, indispensable for any combat success, existed in the Coral Sea battle only in those commanders who actually attacked the enemy forces. None of our surviving officers of the Coral Sea battle could have foreseen the terrible strategic implications of their colossal blunder. The crippled Yorktown was permitted to escape when perhaps a single torpedo or only a few bombs could have ensured that vessel's destruction. A month later, that same ship, which we then permitted to survive, became one of the strongest factors contributing to our Navy's shattering defeat in the Battle of Midway. Every last officer and crewman lost in the attacks on the evening of May 7th was a skilled, irreplaceable veteran. Had these men and their planes not been lost in the debacle of May 7th, they could have participated in the attack against the enemy carriers on May 8th, and quite possibly could have crippled the Yorktown as our remaining planes had disabled the Lexington. In retrospect, it is no exaggeration to state that those few Grumman Wildcats which were in the air on May 7th, and which intercepted our planes on their return to their own carriers, saved not only the Yorktown, but also eventually many other American ships then in the Coral Sea. The results of the Coral Sea battle forced Vice Admiral Inoue to postpone indefinitely the planned invasion of Port Moresby. This delay in operations in the Southern Pacific, however, did not seriously affect the execution of the Midway and Aleutian operations, which our General Staff had long before decided upon. Despite its less obvious overtones, Tokyo still regarded the Coral Sea battle only as a minor setback, and merely the first such incident after 4 successive months of brilliant victories. The Navy's faith in its air arm, on which it had relied so heavily and successfully, was undiminished. The record to date justified this confidence, since from the war's outset all the major blows inflicted upon an enemy staggering from repeated defeats were struck by this same naval air force. Indeed, not only had we swept clean the vast ocean areas in which our ships and planes operated, but we had achieved our goals at an unbelievably low cost in ships, planes, and men. There existed no reason to expect that these same forces which now ruled the Pacific and Indian Oceans would do otherwise than continue their victorious engagements against the enemy. At staff conferences held in early May aboard the Yamato, we studied the gains and losses of both our fleet and that of the enemy, from the opening of the war until the close of the Coral Sea battle. On December 8, 1941, at Pearl Harbor, our carrier-based planes sank or disabled the United States battleships Nevada, California, Arizona, West Virginia, Maryland, and Oklahoma, and heavily damaged the battleships Pennsylvania and Tennessee. We sent to the bottom the old target ship Utah, the cruiser Helena, and 2 destroyers. Several other vessels were heavily damaged, and the enemy suffered heavy damage to shore installations and the loss of many planes. On December 10, 1941, off Kuantan, our land-based bombers sank the British dreadnoughts Repulse and Prince of Wales. On February 4, 1942, in the sea north of Java, our land-based bombers heavily damaged the American heavy cruiser Houston and the light cruiser Marblehead. On the 27th of the same month, off Cilacap, Java, the seaplane tender Langley went to the bottom after an attack by land-based bombers. The following day, our land-based bombers struck again, sinking the British heavy cruiser Exeter. Off Colombo on April 5th, carrier-based bombers sank the British heavy cruisers Cornwall and Dorsetshire. 4 days later, off Trincomalee, carrier-based bombers destroyed the first enemy aircraft carrier, the British Hermes. On May 8th, in the Coral Sea Battle, carrier-based bombers sank the 33,000-ton American aircraft carrier Lexington and heavily damaged the Yorktown, another American carrier. In the first 6 months of the war, therefore, our naval aviation alone had sunk 2 aircraft carriers and seriously damaged a third, sent to the bottom 1 seaplane tender, either sunk or heavily damaged 10 battleships, destroyed 4 and heavily damaged 2 cruisers, and sunk 10 destroyers. Conversely, our damages and losses from enemy air activities in warships the size of or larger than destroyers amounted only to 3 vessels sunk and 1 heavily damaged. On December 11, 1941, Grumman Wildcat fighter planes off Wake Island sank the destroyer Kisaragi. At Tulagi, on May 4, 1942, we lost the destroyer Kikuzuki. And on May 7th, in the Coral Sea Battle, we lost the aircraft carrier Shoho. The following day, the carrier Shokaku received heavy damage from American carrier planes. With the exception of the single submarine attack on January 11, 1942, in which the 33,000-ton aircraft carrier Saratoga was hit by torpedoes, approximately 250 nautical miles northeast of Johnston, the only damage inflicted to enemy vessels by our warships occurred in the period between late February and early March of 1942. All engagements took place in the Java Sea, where our warships sank the Netherlands light cruisers De Ruyter and Java, the Australian light cruiser Perth, the American heavy cruiser Houston, and 5 destroyers of various countries. On the other hand, not a single Japanese warship lost during this period to enemy action, other than air attack went down before the guns of enemy ships, as this listing shows. December 12, 1941. Destroyer Hayate, sunk off Wake Island by enemy shore guns. December 18, 1941. Destroyer Shinonome, sunk by mine explosion off Miri, Borneo. December 24, 1941. Destroyer Sagiri, sunk off Kuching, Borneo, by torpedo attack of a Netherlands submarine. February 8, 1942. Destroyer Natsushiro, sunk off Makassar Celebes, by torpedo attack of United States submarine. May 3, 1942. Seaplane tender Mizuho, sunk off the southern coast of Japan proper, by torpedo attack of United States submarine. May 11, 1942. Mine layer Okinoshima, sunk off Rabaul by torpedo attack of a United States submarine. Compared to the losses sustained by the Allied powers in the Pacific, therefore, we suffered very lightly indeed. The tally of enemy and Japanese ships lost in the first 6 months of the war was a literal realization of the Navy's concept of ideal combat conditions, to wage a decisive sea battle only under air control. For the 10 years prior to the Pacific War, we had trained our airmen implicitly to believe that sea battles fought under our command of the air could result only in our victories. The initial phases of the Pacific War dramatically upheld this belief. War, however, is a vast drama in which it is often impossible to predict the morrow through logic alone. The chain of events established by previous combat engagements may be altered completely in a few short hours. Despite exhaustive planning and preparation prior to any battle, only the gods know what course that battle will take. It appears that in any conflict in which great numbers of men and machines are pitted against one another, some force beyond that exercised by man is responsible for the final decision. While the course of the Pacific War for its first 6 months became a parade of brilliant Japanese victories, no sensible man could honestly believe that an abrupt change was not in store for our country. In the immense arena of the Pacific War, Japan could realize a final victory only through rapid and powerful blows against the forces of the United States and Great Britain. To accomplish our aims with our limited industrial resources, we had to strike quickly, to throw off balance an enemy of great industrial might before that enemy could bring to bear upon us the full weight of its military strength. No Japanese military student possessing any basic knowledge of military logistics could fail to foresee ultimate defeat for our nation in a prolonged war. We, who were informed of the true status of the economic industrial strength of America and England, as compared to that of Japan, knew that our nation could emerge victorious from this war not merely through military gains, but more probably as the result of military political diplomatic actions. It was imperative that we attain and consolidate initial gains, for eventually we would meet in the far reaches of the Pacific an avalanche of Allied military power. Those people cognizant of this situation expected the government, as it had done in the Sino-Japanese and the Russo-Japanese wars, soon to resort to diplomatic negotiations at a time most advantageous to Japan. To prolong the war was only to allow America's factories the time necessary to completely overwhelm our own military strength. International diplomacy, as conducted from a perspective wider than merely that of the geographical boundaries of Pacific-Asiatic combat, was the only means through which we could benefit from the Pacific War. Japan did not possess the military-industrial economic strength necessary to successfully conclude a purely military struggle against the United States and Great Britain. Unfortunately, the vital requirements for international diplomatic negotiations never were achieved. The military hierarchy disastrously decided to continue the war strictly on a military basis. Once committed to total conflict, positive aggressive action is the only means by which to hasten the conclusion of a war. On the theory that only by continued strikes against the enemy could Japan either expand or securely maintain her victories gained in the war's initial 6 months, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, planned to attack American forces at Midway Island and in the Aleutians chain in a single concerted mass sweep. The Midway and Aleutian operations, as we designated the assault, would be undertaken early in June of 1942 as the first step of the second stage operations. The series of major actions which emerged from this widespread campaign brought disastrous results to our Navy, especially in the Battle of Midway, where our fleet suffered a devastating defeat. So severe were the consequences of this great fleet engagement that in a single stroke Japan's favourable position in Pacific Ocean air-sea combat was altered. The Battle of Midway was the pivotal point of the Pacific War. In a single day, we lost 4 aircraft carriers, as well as their aircraft complement, and the irreplaceable combat veteran crews. Our defeat stemmed directly from our Navy Air Force's loss in air superiority, both on a qualitative and a quantitative basis. We had 2 specific objectives in mind for the Midway and Aleutian operations. By invading and occupying Midway Island, we would extend greatly to the east our warship and bomber patrol lines, while the occupation of Kiska and Attu Islands in the western end of the Aleutians Island chain would prevent United States task forces in the far north from attacking the Japanese mainland. These island occupations constituted the campaign's initial phase. The second was to draw out the remainder of the United States Pacific Fleet and to hasten the end of the war by destroying that fleet. The Americans could not allow our eastward and northward thrusts to go unopposed. Their fleet would feel compelled to oppose our attacking forces with every last plane and ship. Admiral Yamamoto, by forcing this showdown, would determine to a large extent the final outcome of the Pacific War. With Midway Island in our hands, we would have a powerful forward base from which to extend further the aggressive actions of our ships and planes. Admiral Yamamoto assembled a tremendous striking force for his attack. His total naval strength for the combined operation included 350 vessels of all types, which exceeded a total of 1,500,000 tons. For an all-out aerial assault against the Americans, he gathered more than 1,000 warplanes. More than 100,000 officers and men manned his ships and planes. Our attacking fleet dwarfed in numbers and offensive strength any previous assembly of ships, planes, and men. Not only did we enjoy great numerical strength, but we had a further advantage in that the handling and combat quality of the men and the planes aboard the aircraft carriers Kaga, Akagi, Hiryu, and Soryu were superior to those of any comparable enemy group. These battle-tested veterans, outstanding in their flying skill, went into the attack under the brilliant command of Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, who had devastated Pearl Harbor and wrought a path of destruction across the Pacific. The crews and pilots of the 4 carriers actually looked down upon the other 2 carriers under Nagumo, the Shokaku and the Zuikaku, which had participated, rather ineffectively in the opinion of Nagumo's other veterans, in the Coral Sea battle. For some reason, through a series of incredible blunders on the part of our fleet, we threw away this priceless advantage. Our Navy committed so many inexcusable errors in the battle commencing on June 5th that we have often wondered if the gods of war had determined beforehand the outcome of the conflict. Through the courageous yet costly attacks by the American land and carrier-based warplanes, and also the enemy submarines, the Nagumo force was completely defeated, compelling Admiral Yamamoto to withdraw his battered fleet without attaining even a part of his original objectives at Midway. The attack commenced at 1:45 a.m. on June 5, 1942. Under the command of Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga of the Hiryu, 36 Zero fighters, 36 Type 99 Val dive bombers, and 36 Type 97 Kate attack bombers took off from 4 carriers. These planes directed their attacks against important ground facilities on Midway Island. We expected heavy resistance and posed great confidence in the ability of the Zeros to protect their bombers, no easy task when 36 fighter planes must escort twice their number of bombers. Approximately 30 nautical miles from Midway Island, more than 30 enemy fighter planes jumped our formations, starting a running air fight which continued directly over the island. Under the leadership of Lieutenant Masaharu Suganami, the Zeros managed to prevent the enemy fighter planes from seriously interfering with the bombing attacks. The Nagumo Force's official combat report of this particular raid reveals that we lost 2 Kates, 1 Val and 2 Zero fighters, and that it was believed that these planes were destroyed by the fierce enemy anti-aircraft fire. In his post-attack intelligence briefing, Lieutenant Tomonaga reported that his fighters and bombers shot down 40 enemy fighters, 1 light bomber, and 1 seaplane in their attack against Midway Island. Intelligence reduced this number appreciably, for it was obvious that double counting by our pilots was responsible for the unusually high number of enemy losses reported. Post-war investigation of this particular battle with officers of the U.S. Navy section of the Strategic Bombing Survey revealed that 20 Brewster F-2A Buffaloes and 7 Grumman F-4F Wildcats attacked Tomonaga's force. Of these, 17 were shot down, including the fighter commander, Major Parks. 7 other enemy fighters sustained heavy damage, and most of the surviving pilots were injured. The Zero fighters defending our carriers set up against the first wave of Midway-based enemy torpedo bombers an almost impenetrable wall of fire. More than 60 torpedo bombers raced in at low altitude to attack Nagumo's carriers. The American pilots pressed home their attacks with great courage, but their lumbering aircraft fell easy prey to the Zeros and the fleet's defending gunfire. The initial enemy attack became a massacre, as almost all of the American planes fell flaming into the ocean. Not a single torpedo struck our ships. Our fleet waited apprehensively for the second attack, which came this time from large carrier-based enemy formations. They did not have long to wait, and the Zeros slashed into the enemy planes, disrupting formations and scattering the bombers. Even as the second enemy wave battled fiercely to break through the defending cordon of Zero fighters, keeping our planes occupied near the water's surface, large numbers of American dive bombers suddenly appeared on the scene. It was the beginning of the end, for our fleet was caught completely unaware by this sudden assault. Almost unopposed, the enemy bombers plunged in vertical dives from above the clouds. Our carriers were helpless. Bomb after bomb smashed into our ship's vitals, flooding compartments, destroying gun control systems, knocking out firefighting apparatus, setting aflame gasoline and oil tanks. Within an hour of the attack, the Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were crippled hulks in sinking condition. Several hours later, the three great ships went down. Nagumo had suffered a grievous blow, for in this single dive-bombing attack, the Americans had reduced by more than half his available fighter and bomber strength. With the first battle phase completed, and with our fleet reeling from its severe losses, we launched an attack against the American carriers. 18 Type 99. VAL dive bombers and 6 Zero fighters left Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi's flagship Hiryu, the only carrier to escape the enemy's bombs. Led by Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi, the 18 bombers dove through a hail of anti-aircraft fire and defending enemy fighter planes to score more than 3 direct hits on the Yorktown. Soon after Kobayashi left the Hiryu, Lieutenant Tomonaga led 10 Type 97 Kate torpedo bombers and 6 Zero fighters in search of a second American carrier. Again, our planes encountered fierce resistance, but our returning pilots reported that they had sent 2 torpedoes directly into the big warship. Rear Admiral Yamaguchi felt relieved, for now his planes had heavily damaged 2 enemy carriers. We later discovered that actually we had twice attacked the Yorktown, not a second carrier as originally believed. Yamaguchi did not have long to enjoy the news of the attack for, shortly afterward, enemy carrier-based bombers found the Hiryu. The rain of bombs crippled the flagship in short order, and like her sister ships, soon the Hiryu became a helpless hulk, racked with flaming explosions and abandoned by her crew. This may appear paradoxical, but in my estimate, I feel that the Hiryu's air group had been superior in combat to its American carrier-based counterparts. Many factors which are not apparent to the uninformed observer influence a battle's final outcome. In the vast Midway conflict, the Americans had a definite advantage in that their carriers were equipped with radar, enabling them to receive out-of-sight advance warning of air attacks, while our own vessels lacked this priceless equipment. Every Japanese aircraft committed to the attack against enemy surface ships, and the installations at Midway Island performed admirably. Despite the staggering loss of our carriers, there still remained no doubt that the Zero fighter exceeded in performance any of the American planes which it contested. Our VAL dive bombers and Kate torpedo bombers were at the time 2 of the world's best aircraft for their respective missions. There was little to criticize in the performance and courage of our air crew members under fire. Every man did his utmost to press home the attacks against the American warships, particularly Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, who on his final mission took off from his carrier with the knowledge that he could not possibly return. With 3 of our carriers already lost, it was imperative that we either cripple or sink the enemy aircraft carriers. Tomonaga took off in his final attack with only his right wing tank containing fuel. Enemy bullets had holed the left tank over Midway. This outstanding officer would not let his aircraft remain idle while his fellow pilots flew into combat. This action, similar to that of Flight Warrant Officer Kano in the Coral Sea battle, did much to uphold the morale of our men in the face of terrible losses. Despite the determination and courage of our men and the high performance of our airplanes, the American aircraft overwhelmed our best defences. No one could have foreseen the effectiveness of their courageous attacks. Their tenacity brought the Battle of Midway to a tragic end. The loss of the 4 aircraft carriers, the Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, and Soryu, shocked the Japanese people. We could not underestimate the gravity of our defeat, for these 4 carriers had played the major role in the Navy's smashing victories across the breadth of the entire Pacific. An even greater blow, however, was the loss of the irreplaceable veteran air crews and the skilled maintenance crews, which went down with their ships. Even as we reeled from the debacle of Midway, another event occurred far to the north, which, although lacking the drama of open conflict, was no less serious. In the Aleutians, one of our Zero fighters made a forced landing and was captured almost intact by the Americans. The subsequent detailed study of the airplane revealed fully to the Americans the Zero's advantages and faults. With the airplane's every characteristic an open book to the enemy engineers, they could quickly assure their own qualitative superiority. Early in the morning of June 4, 1942, the aircraft carriers Ryujo and Junyo of Rear Admiral Kakuji Kakuda's 2nd Carrier Task Force approached Dutch Harbour. The task force's stealthy and unobserved move to the Aleutians actually was the opening blow of the Midway and Aleutian operations. Lashed by cold winds and driving rain, the Junyo launched 6 Zero fighters and 12 Type 99 Val dive bombers in the first attack against the American positions. During their flight, our formations encountered several enemy flying boats, which they engaged and destroyed. This delay in flight, in addition to the violent storms encountered en route, forced the Zeros and Vals to abandon their mission. However, 6 Zeros and 11 Type 97 Kate attack bombers from the Ryujo failed to encounter enemy aircraft on their approach to Dutch Harbour. Led by Lieutenant Masayuki Yamagami, the formation battled heavy rain and thick fog, arriving over the enemy base above a solid layer of clouds. Fortunately, the sky cleared directly over the harbour, and our planes dove to the attack. The Kates bombed the radio stations and pier installations, while the Zeros, free from enemy fighters, strafed a number of flying boats tied to harbour buoys. After the attack, the bombers and fighters reassembled over the eastern end of Unalaska Island, where Flight Petty Officer Tadayoshi Koga noticed that his Zero trailed a thin spray of gasoline. Informing Kobayashi that he did not have enough fuel to return to the Ryujo, Koga dropped low over a small island eastward of Dutch Harbour, which had been designated as an emergency landing site for crippled planes. Once down on the island, the pilots would be picked up by a submarine. On his return to the carrier, Kobayashi reported to his superior, "The emergency landing site appeared from the air to be flat and clear. Koga made his approach perfectly, but immediately after the wheels struck the ground, the airplane tipped over, remaining upright. The Zero appeared to be heavily damaged, and either the pilot died or he must have been seriously injured. Since the island surface seems to be tundra, it would be difficult to remove the wreckage. We could not discern any sign of human habitation in the vicinity. We did not learn until many months afterward that an enemy reconnaissance plane discovered the Zero. Ground parties rushed to the site found an airplane only slightly damaged, still upright. Koga had been killed by the shock of landing. His head struck the instrument panel with great force. Koga apparently realized that to land in the water off the island would have been certain death, for the temperature was so low that only several minutes of exposure to the cold would have killed him. Notified of the emergency crash landing, our submarine scoured the area, but did not sight the wreckage on the island. The Americans removed the airplane to the United States, where it was repaired and subjected to exhaustive test flights. They were surprised at the Zero's unusually light weight and by the fact that the airplane's high performance was achieved with an engine of but 1,000 horsepower. It was quickly established that the Zero's greatest weaknesses lay in its poor diving ability and in its lack of armour plate protection. The flight tests revealed also that at high speeds the Zero responded sluggishly to aileron control, and that it was limited in altitude performance. Aware of the Zero's minutest details, the Americans rushed to complete a fighter airplane intended specifically to wrest from Japan the advantages afforded by the Zero. This was the United States Navy's Grumman F-6F Hellcat, one of the most versatile enemy planes to be encountered in the Pacific. The F-6F was the first plane designed by the Grumman Company following their thorough study of the captured Zero fighter. Grumman engineers painstakingly reduced the thickness of the fuselage and bent every effort to reduce structural weight. With a 2,000 horsepower engine, the new Hellcat had a higher maximum speed than the Zero, could outclimb and outdrive and outgun it, and retained the desired benefits of high structural strength, armour plating, and self-sealing fuel tanks. In fact, with the exception of turning radius and radius of action, the Hellcat completely outperformed the Zero. The advantages of superior engines stood the enemy in good stead, for the Hellcat was twice as powerful as the Zero. This sudden performance increase, combined with the rising tidal wave of American production, forecast the overwhelming strength the enemy would soon bring to bear against the homeland itself. In the Aleutian campaign, I, Okumiya, was Admiral Kakuda's air staff officer. I could not realize at the time how far-reaching an effect this seemingly trivial incident of losing to the enemy a single intact Zero could have. We felt strongly that the unnoticed capture of the airplane, assisting the enemy so greatly in producing a fighter plane intended specifically to overcome the Zero's advantages, did much to hasten our final defeat. Meanwhile, in Japan, our government harped on the victories of the Aleutians attacks and the island occupations. The continual emphasis on our successes in the far north was, of course, merely a diversionary effort to conceal from the people the terrible losses at Midway. The results of the Battle of Midway rudely awakened our naval general staffs. Only 6 months after Pearl Harbor, following a succession of unprecedented victories, and stronger than it ever had been before in its entire existence, the Navy retreated sorely wounded from Midway. The sudden insight which this defeat afforded our commanding officers forced them to realize that Midway had voided the concept of the battleship as the prime naval power, and that victory or defeat at sea fundamentally rested on the effectiveness of the aircraft carrier. With the understanding that air power, not the usually impotent 16-inch guns, decided naval battles, our planning staff also came to appreciate the thin-skinned vulnerability of the aircraft carrier, which would always experience the fury of enemy attack. At one sweep, Tokyo discarded its policy of offensive operations and substituted for it a new curving defense line, which was to be held at virtually all costs before an enemy who was now expected to commence his own assault operations. The outermost reaches of the new defense line extended west of the Aleutian Islands in the north, to the Marshall Islands in the east, from Rabaul to the northeast coast of New Guinea in the south, to the Dutch East Indies, Malaya, and Burma in the west. To most efficiently defend these lines, we reorganized the combined fleet. The new effort concentrated on maximizing the development of our land-based air forces, and we accelerated our program of rebuilding the surface fleet around a center of aircraft carriers. On July 14, 1942, the Navy echelons received their reorganization orders, with the following tables of the new First-Line Air Corps. These figures indicated the intrinsic defects in Japan's military strength. Compared to the number of first-line naval planes at the war's outset, we had increased our strength by only 117 aircraft. Further, we now had an increase of only 74 planes over the total available immediately prior to the Battle of Midway. Our naval air strength in numbers remained basically static, while the enemy feverishly prepared his industry for the production of more and more warplanes. The future looked dark indeed. There was another weak link in our air power chain which, although lacking the effect of total numbers of aircraft, presaged more severe defeats than we suffered at Midway. Since the war's outset, the Navy had adopted, or was about to adopt, only 3 new type planes. These were the 113 Shi carrier-based dive bomber, the Suisei, or Type 2 carrier-based reconnaissance plane Judy, the 13 Shi large-type flying boat, the Type 2 flying boat Emily, and the 13 Shi twin-engined land-based fighter, the Gecko, or Type 2 land-based reconnaissance plane Irving. Our domestic aeronautical engineering and production outlook was bleak. Despite the pressing demands of combat, we could not hope to accelerate further the development and production of new type aircraft. Geared to a specific low pace, our industry could not, even in time of need, discard its own shackles. The overall situation seemed even worse when one realized that, even with these difficulties, the Navy was infinitely better off than the Army. During the first 6 to 7 months of the war, the Zero remained the Navy's only frontline fighter airplane, and bore the entire burden of all fighter operations. Even in mass production, the airplane still featured outstanding performance, ease of maintenance, and dependability. We experienced but 2 operational difficulties: the occasional failure of the landing gear shaft under heavy shock loads, and poor release of the jettisonable auxiliary fuel tank. Even by mid-July of 1942, the Navy did not contemplate replacing the Zero with another fighter. As we worked to rebuild and reorganize the combined fleet's various air corps, our worst fears were realized. The enemy no longer fell back helplessly. The counterattack in Guadalcanal had begun. Although the Navy acted immediately after the Battle of Midway to drastically change its warship-building policy, placing the aircraft carrier ahead of the battleship as the backbone of surface power, the damage had already been done. We realized too late that a preponderance of battleship strength could not strategically affect the outcome of important campaigns. Every type of surface vessel was at the mercy of carrier-borne aircraft, and American strength in carrier aviation increased by fantastic leaps and bounds. Although constantly exhorted to backbreaking efforts, our industry could do little to contest the monumental production of America's shipyards. Up until immediately after World War I, Japan, as one of the three great naval powers, maintained a surface navy centered around powerful battleship strength. By doing so, we established a balance of naval power with the United States and Great Britain. With the international conflict over, in 1919, Japan turned to its new so-called Hachi-Hachi fleet plan, which was to give our nation the strongest fleet afloat. The to-be reorganized Navy would center around 8 battleships, Hachi, including the Mutsu and Nagato, and 8 new battlecruisers, including the Akagi and Amagi, which were then under construction. At the time, our largest planned battleship exceeded by a considerable margin any foreign ship, for we were to construct a giant dreadnought of 48,000 tons. However, because naval air power in 1919 was restricted to auxiliary activities, the Hachi-Hachi fleet plan called for only 2 small aircraft carriers of 12,500 tons each. In 1918, 1 year before the Navy drafted the Hachi-Hachi fleet plan, we laid the keel for the Hosho, Japan's first aircraft carrier. On March 16, 1923, Lieutenant Shunichi Kira, later to become a vice admiral, became the first Japanese pilot to land on a carrier deck when he brought a plane down on the Hosho. Because the Washington Naval Conference restricted the maximum tonnage of our battleships, we modified our broad naval program and planned to convert the battlecruisers Akagi and Amagi into large aircraft carriers, the latter as the Kaga. In 1927, we decided to expand our carrier strength with the new Ryujo, bringing our total to 4 fleet aircraft carriers. Again, international events interfered, for the London Naval Conference of 1930 imposed further restrictions on our warship expansion. In 1934, after the adoption of the London Naval Treaty, we instituted the second supplemental plan, which called for the powerful carriers Soryu and Hiryu. Although it seemed as if the Navy would finally receive the large and fast warships it coveted, the limitations of the 2 naval treaties by which we were bound halted further construction for 2 years. Late in 1936, the disarmament treaties were abrogated, and the Navy instituted a new construction plan which called for maximum shipyard efforts. Under the third replenishment plan, popularly known as the Martisan Plan, we began the actual build-up of the fleet into one of the world's greatest sea powers. Included in the new program were the famous super-dreadnoughts Yamato and Musashi, and the aircraft carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku, both of which exceeded by a considerable margin the performance and efficiency of the Akagi and the Kaga. In 1938, we planned the construction of 2 additional Yamato-class, 74,000 tons battleships, and an outsized aircraft carrier, the Taiho, with unusually heavy armament. By 1939, our shipyards began the conversion of large merchant vessels into aircraft carriers. The first of these ships to be so altered, the modern passenger ship Kasuga Maru, was followed by Japan's 2 largest passenger ships, the 27,000-ton vessels Izumo Maru and Kashihara Maru. 4 additional commercial vessels, each exceeding 10,000 tons, were brought into the carrier conversion program. Because of the changing international situation in 1942, the Navy called for a speed-up of the wartime construction plan of 1941, under which we added to our shipbuilding program one more aircraft carrier, the Hiryu-class Unru. Early in 1942, however, the Navy still regarded as its priority weapon the heavy, fast battleships, and ordered construction to begin on another 74,000-ton battleship, 2 new type battleships, 2 30,000-ton aircraft carriers, and 1 17,000-ton aircraft carrier. The devastating defeat at Midway forced a halt in the new construction program, even as the shipyards worked on the keels of the mighty new warships. The Navy abandoned further work on the 4th Yamato-type battleship, then in its initial stages, and ordered a halt to all battleship construction. The 3rd 74,000-ton battleship, the Shinano, was converted to the greatest aircraft carrier ever built. The ship failed to see combat, for on her maiden voyage on November 28, 1944, she was crippled by the American submarine Archerfish and sank the following day. To provide carrier aviation across the Pacific expanse, the Navy also ordered 15 new Hiryu-type carriers and 5 Taiho-type carriers. Our efforts came much too late, due to a combination of circumstances, including the stoppage of raw materials to the homeland and the increasing bombardment of our shipyards by enemy planes. Only 4 of the 15 planned Hiryu-type carriers came off the ways. None of the planned Taiho-class carriers was completed. The following table lists the entire carrier strength of the Japanese Navy up to the close of the Pacific War. This material was compiled from official documents on August 15, 1945. Especially significant in the first half of 1942 were the great battles of Midway and the Coral Sea. These 2 vital engagements were decided solely by the weight of air power, despite the commitment of numerous opposing land and sea forces. Despite this obvious superiority of combat aerial forces to other armaments, however, the United States and Japan failed equally to evaluate properly the significant role of air power in these 2 engagements. Of the land-based air forces in combat at this time, the only major command which maintained heavy and continuous air action against the enemy was the 25th Air Flotilla, consisting of the Tainan Air Corps, the 4th Air Corps, and the Yokohama Air Corps. The headquarters of these forces was at Rabaul and was under the command of Rear Admiral Sadayoshi Yamada. The flotilla engaged in constant air attack, concentrating the full force of its strength against the enemy at Port Moresby, New Guinea. Of lesser consequence were the intermittent attacks which it mounted against Port Darwin, Australia, with medium attack bombers of the 23rd Air Flotilla based on Timor Island. The air attacks against Port Moresby were always made, as was characteristic of this phase of the war, with comparatively heavy formations composed of 27 or more land-based medium attack bombers and an approximately equal number of escorting Zero fighters. For some time we had been preparing for the capture of Port Moresby. In order to facilitate this undertaking, a naval landing force attacked Buna on the northeastern coast of New Guinea on July 21, 1942. This invading force was subjected to a fierce and damaging air attack by approximately 100 enemy planes on the following day. As a result of this sudden assault, our beleaguered naval units were placed in a precarious position, and it became necessary to neutralize the enemy air force attacking the forces at Buna. The greater part of the enemy's air strength was based at Port Moresby, and, to a lesser extent, at the airfields at Rabi, on the southeastern end of New Guinea. Our naval air forces prepared immediately to neutralize Rabi in an all-out attack on August 7, 1942. Preparations were well underway for the heavy assault when, abruptly, our attention was brought to bear on a little-known island in the southern group of the Solomon Islands. The enemy had invaded Guadalcanal in what proved to be only the first of a long series of attacks. Part of the personal element of the struggle for the air over the Guadalcanal area is vividly recounted in the following battle record of Flight Petty Officer First Class Saburo Sakai, later promoted to Lieutenant J.G., who was at that time a section leader of the Tainan Air Corps. The major combatants of World War II experienced many incredible happenings in this long drawn-out air war. Pilots and aircrew members who were severely wounded in combat miraculously continued on flying duty to an extent far beyond what was previously imagined possible. Pilots who might be presumed dead continued to fly their planes, and planes which should have disintegrated under enemy fire somehow, beyond all reason, remained in the air and brought their awed and reverent crews safely home. Petty Officer Sakai, at the close of World War II, was the chief surviving Japanese air ace, whose combat initiation against American flyers was marked by such incidents as his being the first Japanese pilot to shoot down a Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress, Philippines, December 11, 1941. His story, even among the epic incidents of the air war in the Pacific, is one of the most incredible episodes ever related. Guadalcanal. A name, merely a name. We did not even know what Guadalcanal was. An island, a military base, a secret operation code name, perhaps. When the American forces stormed ashore at Guadalcanal, we had never even heard of the island. It was still a few hours before the people of the world unfolded and spread out their maps of the South Pacific to search for this tiny island. Japanese and American communiques did not as yet mention the name of Guadalcanal, and the constantly broadcast news programs failed to mention this new name, which would soon flare into international prominence. Here at Rabaul, on the eastern end of New Britain Island, the sky was clear. Not even a breeze disturbed the prevalent heat and tranquility. Simpson Bay lay in slumber like a sheltered lake, its surface an unrippled sheet of glass reflecting the blue of the sky. It was completely encircled by low, lush hills, except for the lone entrance which opened to the east. At the northeastern shore of the bay, threads of white smoke drifted lazily upward from the temporarily stilled throat of a volcano. The smoke gleamed and shone as it caught the rays of the scorching sun. The sides of the volcano dipped, and their inclines disappeared suddenly into the dense jungle foliage, except at the point at which the southern slope ended. Here the jungle had been hacked, ripped apart and banished, replaced by a long, narrow strip of land running from east to west. This was Rabaul Lower Airstrip. At Vunakanau, where the land stretched flat as the surface of a table high above the sea, another slender clearing stood out against the natural growth of the island. This was Rabaul Upper Airstrip. In sharp contrast to the tranquility of the scene and the oppressive heat of the moment, a group of heavily clothed young men stood before a nondescript shack on the northern side of the fighter airstrip. In a land where even a summer shirt brings sticky sweat cascading freely down one's body, the young men were incongruously bundled into heavy flying suits, boots, awkward life jackets, and other weighty equipment. Revolvers were cradled within well-oiled leather holsters. These were fighter pilots of the Tainan Air Corps, recently transferred to the blanketing heat and mugginess of Rabaul from Bali Island in the Dutch East Indies. I was one of those fighter pilots, a section leader. Ever since our arrival at Rabaul, we had faced the American and Australian air forces based at Port Moresby on New Guinea. This morning, however, our usual mission of fighter patrol, attack against Moresby or air-to-air combat, was to be replaced with a special attack against the Rabi Air Base at Milne Bay, on the south end of New Guinea. The pilots spoke with enthusiasm to each other. "Maybe today we'll have a big fight," one said. "I'd sure like to get a kill," another added. Our pilots were understandably eager to engage the enemy fighter planes in combat. The results obtained with our Zero fighter against enemy airplanes had been so amazing that often the enemy appeared openly to fear our arrival and, at times, had even refused to join combat. As we checked each other's equipment and made the final preparations for takeoff to escort the bombers which would attack Rabi, a messenger ran past us into the operations room with a radio message. Whatever it contained obviously created a major stir among our officers. We could see Captain Masahisa Saito, our commanding officer, Yasuna Kozono, the air officer, and Lieutenant Commander Tadashi Nakajima, who was to command today's attack, gathered around a large map spread hastily on one of the desks. We listened closely to the conversation of the officers, and every now and then could catch the words Guadalcanal and Tulagi. These were strange names. "Where is Guadalcanal, sir?" asked Flight Petty Officer Hattori, 2nd Class, pilot of the 2nd Fighter in my section. "I don't know," I replied. Then, to the group of petty officers and pilots, "Does anybody know where Guadalcanal is?" No answer, only a shaking of heads. Hattori spoke up again. "Nobody knows. Then it cannot be an important place." But the officers within the operations room appeared very serious. One of the officers came out and ordered all pilots to line up immediately. Captain Saito came out. "At 05:25 hours this morning," he said, "a powerful enemy invasion force under heavy cover attacked Lunga Roads, Guadalcanal Island. This is the second island from the south end of the Solomon Island group. Tulagi on Florida Island, which is northeast of Guadalcanal, was also invaded. On Guadalcanal, our engineers have been in the process of constructing an airstrip. At Tulagi, our air units are seriously threatened. The main force of the Yokohama Air Corps, belonging to the 5th Air Flotilla, is stationed on Tulagi. In addition, at the time of the invasion, there were about 10 flying boats and 10 seaplane fighters on the island. The situation is extremely serious. Our naval forces operating in the Rabaul area have been ordered to engage the enemy immediately, in full strength, and to drive back the American invasion forces at any cost." Captain Saito stopped for a moment, then continued. "Our fighter plane units have been ordered to escort the land-based medium attack bombers, which will attack enemy ships. Certain fighter groups will precede the bombers and their escorts into the battle area as challenging units, to draw off the American fighter planes. It is about 560 nautical miles from this base to Guadalcanal Island. This will be the longest mission you have ever been called upon to fly. You will be taxing your airplanes to the utmost, and I want every pilot to take maximum precautions to conserve fuel." Captain Saito was finished. As we were already prepared for immediate takeoff, the only change in our plans was to receive the exact location of the battle area and to prepare the necessary air maps for each pilot. I began to outline the course we would follow to Guadalcanal, noting the great distance our planes would be flying. Guadalcanal is along a string of isles. This won't be any trouble. Just before we climbed into the Zeros, we were given a special briefing by Lieutenant J.G. Yunzo Sasai, the 2nd Squadron leader and my immediate superior. He was unusually serious. The American fighters over the Guadalcanal area are known to have come from aircraft carriers supporting the invasion. They are probably regular American Navy fighters, not Army planes brought in especially for this attack. This is the first time we will be meeting American Navy fighters. Be careful and never lose sight of my plane. United States naval planes. Just to hear that we would meet them excited me. I had been anxious to meet American carrier pilots for a long time. Now my chance had come. I had been flying fighters for 6 years and had more than 3,000 hours in the air. I had participated in our attacks on the Chinese inland cities of Chongqing, Chengdu, Lanzhou, and others in the Sino-Japanese incident. Since the outbreak of the Pacific War, I had fought in the Philippines and the Dutch East Indies. So far, I had shot down 56 enemy planes and was one of the leading aces of all Japanese naval fighter pilots. But I had never met any carrier planes. As aircraft carrier fighter pilots must receive elaborate training for landing and taking off from the narrow decks of carriers, there were many unusually skilled pilots among our carrier personnel. The same situation probably prevailed among the American carrier pilots. Well, my chance has finally come, I thought. Let's see how well they can fight. At 0800 hours, our Zero fighters left the field, one after the other, assuming 3-plane formations as we climbed away from the fighter strip. We then adopted escort positions above and behind the medium attack bombers. There were 27 bombers escorted by 18 fighters, with the former flying at about 15,000 feet. I was flight leader of the second section of the 2nd Fighter Squadron. We flew southward along the line of the Solomon Islands. Shortly before noon, the pilots were able to make out the waters of Lunga Roads off Guadalcanal Island. There were scattered clouds at about 13,000 feet, but above and below that level, the sky was absolutely clear. We searched Lunga Roads carefully and gradually distinguished the shapes of the enemy ships in the area. The water seemed covered with vessels. I had never seen so large a convoy before, although I had flown on many occasions over Japanese troopship fleets during our invasion operations. I couldn't help admiring the men below me, even though they were enemies. Action ahead. At that moment, the fighter planes of the challenge units, which had preceded our flight by about 10 minutes, seemed to attack enemy fighter planes. Far ahead of us, we could see the bright yellow flashes peculiar to burning aircraft bursting like so many sparks. 7 or 8 lines of smoke streamed down toward the ground, drawing graceful, curving arcs in the sky. Somebody's airplanes had been shot down, but it was impossible at this distance to tell whether they were ours or those of the enemy. The dogfight broke up quickly, and we could no longer see any aircraft, friendly or enemy, in the air. Seeing the sky clear of enemy fighter planes, our attack bombers suddenly began shallow dives toward the enemy ships, picking up speed as they prepared to bomb. Because of the sudden change in plan from the original schedule to attack Rabi, our bombers had not had time to replace their bombs with torpedoes. Consequently, they would make high-level attacks. It might go well, I thought, even though torpedo attack was invariably more successful than level bombing against ships. The absence of enemy fighters meant an uninterrupted run for the bombers. Unexpectedly, 2 enemy fighters appeared, headed for our fighter formation. I swung down to attack, and the enemy planes quickly left the area. I had to curb my desire to pursue the enemy fighters, recalling our leader's instructions given to us just before takeoff. Biting my lips in frustration, I climbed back to the formation and resumed my position. Ahead of us, the bombers seemed to lurch slightly as each aircraft released its deadly load. The formation was bombing en masse. The missiles hurtled down toward the enemy ships, and the bomb spread successfully covered the enemy convoy. But only a few of the bombs appeared to hit any ships. We could see about 80 large ships in the enemy fleet. Countless landing barges were heading for the beach, the brilliant white wakes on the water surface having the appearance of brush strokes of a giant but invisible artist. Although it had been only 5 or 6 hours since the enemy invasion forces had stormed in to land on Guadalcanal, what appeared to be enemy anti-aircraft fire could be seen coming from guns on the island. I was amazed at the ability of the enemy to place his anti-aircraft weapons on shore so rapidly. From what we had been told about mass invasions, it took about a week to complete the landing of 30 ships. That was the time required for our army to unload 30 vessels during the landings at Soerabaja in March of this year. Our speed of landing was far behind that being carried out by the enemy below me now. It was hard to believe. I realized intuitively that any invasion force which could push ashore so rapidly would be a very tough foe indeed. The bombing runs were over quickly, and the bombers had already turned and were heading back from Lungs through Tulagi. The fighter escort swung into position to protect the bombers. I had not yet fired a single bullet or cannon shell. Without warning, a group of enemy fighters jumped our formations from above. We could see the tracers spitting through our formations. With this first burst of fire, the fighter planes of both sides, about 30 in all, instantly broke formation. Planes scattered in all directions as our Zeros tried to break free of the attacking enemy. About half the planes in the air could be seen. As I pushed the stick hard over and rolled away, I noticed several aircraft plunging earthward, trailing streaks of black smoke. I managed successfully to dodge the attacking fighters, but in doing so lost sight of 2 of my boys. Damn it, I thought, angry at myself for losing sight of my own pilots. I twisted around and, far below, I saw 3 Zeros pursued by a single enemy fighter. The Zeros were trying desperately to escape from the enemy plane, but the enemy pilot hung doggedly on their tails. The Zeros looked like my boys, Hattori, Yonekawa, and another pilot. The enemy plane was a new type I had never seen before, probably a Grumman F4F Wildcat, a type we were told was in the area. The enemy pilot was very skilled in combat. He was relentless in his attacks against the 3 Zeros. My pilots needed help, and quickly. I pushed the throttle forward, drawing alongside my squadron leader. Signalling Lieutenant Sasai, I pushed the stick forward and dove alone from the squadron to the battle raging below us. Not a second could be wasted. I opened fire on the enemy fighter plane while I was still more than 3,000 feet away. It was too great a distance to cause any damage, but I accomplished my purpose. The moment the enemy pilot became aware of my airplane, he abandoned pursuit of the 3 Zeros at once and turned sharply to meet my attack. This pilot was good. As we fought, twisting and turning, I realized also that the Grumman's fighting performance far exceeded that of any other American, Dutch or Chinese fighter planes I had encountered. But my long experience in air combat finally gave me the margin over this enemy too. As I had always done in the past, I took out my Leica camera and snapped a picture of the new plane as I closed in on the enemy fighter from behind. Thus far, I had taken in this manner a total of 20 rolls of film, or about 700 photographs of airfields and enemy planes both in the air and on the ground. After snapping a shot for proof of the new enemy aircraft, I resumed the attack. When I closed in from the best-fearing angle, approaching from the rear left of the Grumman, the pilot appeared to realize that he could no longer win. He fled at full speed toward Lunga. I had full confidence in my ability to destroy the Grumman and decided to finish off the enemy fighter with only my 7.7mm machine guns. I turned the 20mm cannon switch to the off position and closed in. For some strange reason, even after I had poured about 500 or 600 rounds of ammunition directly into the Grumman, the airplane did not fall but kept on flying. I thought this very odd. It had never happened before, and closed the distance between the two airplanes until I could almost reach out and touch the Grumman. To my surprise, the Grumman's rudder and tail were ripped to shreds, looking like an old torn piece of rag. With his plane in such condition, no wonder the enemy pilot was unable to continue fighting. Even as I studied the condition of the Grumman's tail, my Zero pulled ahead of the enemy fighter. I slid open the canopy and turned to look back at the enemy pilot. He was a big man, with an oval face and a fair complexion. We stared at each other for countless seconds. I would never forget the strange feeling when our eyes met. Keeping alert for any sudden moves by the Grumman, I waved my right hand in a gesture of, "Come on if you dare!" The enemy was behind me now, and in position to attack my plane. He had an excellent opportunity to shoot me down. Perhaps, however, the pilot was seriously wounded. Changing his hand, holding the control stick from the right to his left hand, he acted as though he were praying, "Save me," with his right. After closely observing the strange movements of the enemy pilot, I cut my throttle and fell to the rear of the Grumman. The time had come to destroy the enemy fighter. Switching the cannon position to on, I closed in again and pushed the cannon trigger. I could see the shells exploding all over the Grumman, which went to pieces in the air. The enemy fighter plunged earthward. Far below I saw a parachute open, but lost sight of the pilot as he drifted over Lunga toward land. Later, as I recalled the details of the dogfight, I thought I had done a pitiless thing by destroying the Grumman. But at the time, seeing the enemy pilot administering a severe beating to my own boys, I was so excited that all I could think of was to deliver the fatal blow to the enemy. If the pilot is dead, I wish I could tell his family how well he fought. As soon as the fight had ended, I realized my altitude was much too low for safety. As quickly as possible, I rounded up the pilots in my section. As we closed in toward each other, I took the muffler from my face to identify myself. They appeared overjoyed to discover I was unharmed. No sooner had we climbed in formation above the cloud layer at 15,000 feet than tracer bullets sprayed about us. The bullets were coming from our rear left. One of the enemy slugs smashed into the cockpit and bored a hole the size of my fist through the window just behind my head.